This video is about the U.S. official poverty measure. The first thing to know about the official U.S. poverty measure is that it is a threshold approach to measuring poverty. All this means is that there is a fixed line or threshold, and if a household's pre-tax cash income is even $1 above that line, then everyone in the household is counted as not poor. And the reverse is also true. If the household's pre-tax cash income is even $1 below its threshold for its household type, every member of the household is considered poor. So a pretty straightforward approach. The other thing to know is that our poverty thresholds in the United States are absolute, not relative. Although there are a multiplicity of thresholds, that doesn't make them relative. Each threshold is absolute in the sense that it doesn't depend on the standard of living in the society. It doesn't depend on the amount of income that other households are making or not making. It only depends on how much cash income a particular household is making. The other thing to know about our poverty thresholds in the United States is that they designate amounts of cash income. Now you might ask, what other kind of income is there? All my income is cash. Well, if I think about the amount that Washington and Lee contributes to my health insurance premiums, that is part of my overall compensation. In fact, they send me a letter at the end of every year telling me how much that's worth. But that part of my compensation isn't cash. I can't deposit that money into my bank account and do things with it. The same thing is true of what used to be called food stamps, but which is now called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Although SNAP dollars are dispersed on a credit card-looking device, they're not considered cash income for any statistical purposes in the United States. I can't take my SNAP card to an ATM and withdraw cash. They don't work that way. So because it's not fungible, it's not money that you can spend on any particular commodity that you happen to want, it's not considered cash. The other thing to know about our cash income poverty thresholds is that they calculate income on a pre-tax, not a post-tax basis. It's also important to note that the thresholds are set for households, not individuals. Other poverty measures will take an individual approach rather than a household approach. But because not all households are the same, we do have 48 different poverty thresholds in the United States, and here they are. These are the most recent poverty thresholds, and as you can see, the size of the family unit matters. A one-person household is not going to have the same poverty threshold as a five-person household. For the other thing that matters is the ages of the members of the household. For households with 1 and 2 people, it matters if there's a senior citizen in the home, if there's anyone over 65 in the home. But for households with 3 or more people, it only matters how many adults there are of any age, and how many children there are, how many people are under 18. So for example, if you have a 5-person household consisting of grandma, who's 72, mom and dad, and 2 children, then their poverty threshold would be $28,995 for a 5-person household with 2 children. You might ask, well, where did the numbers in those boxes come from? Did they just drop out of the sky? The answer is no. We have a formula for coming up with the numbers that go into those boxes. And this is the formula. We take the dollar value that was assigned by the United States Department of Agriculture in 1963 to a budget food plan. We multiply that dollar amount by 3. Then we make adjustments for the size of the household and the ages of the people in the household, just like on the 48-cell matrix you just looked at. Then we take all of that and we adjust all those thresholds. We take the $1963 amount and we adjust it for inflation every year. And we do that using the Consumer Price Index, a common measure of inflation. Now, how did we get this formula? It's sort of curious. Meet Molly Orshansky. Molly was the daughter of Ukrainian immigrants. She grew up in New York City, in the Bronx. She studied statistics and economics. For 13 years after World War II ended, she worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I hope you're noticing a theme here. Then, for many years after that, she worked for the Social Security Administration. Molly was a classic bureaucrat. She worked all her life for the government. Now, when Molly was at the Social Security Administration, they had an ongoing research project to figure out a way to use an existing instrument, the Census Bureau's current population survey, to assess the economic well-being of American children. Again, I hope you're sensing a theme here. Children are obviously critical to the poverty thresholds. So Molly was put on this research project, and she decided early on that it would be easier to complete the research project by asking how much income would be inadequate, would be too little for American children to achieve economic well-being, rather than starting the research project by asking how much income is enough income for American children to achieve economic well-being. She felt that that would be much more complex, much more controversial. So it's important to note that the poverty thresholds were designed as indicators of income that's inadequate for economic well-being, not for a level of income that is adequate for economic well-being. This is something that often gets overlooked and that some people are confused on. So what Molly did was she looked around at the different cabinet departments, and she asked around some of her colleagues and contacts, and she said, hey, do you guys have any statistically valid numbers on what people tend to spend on the basic necessities of life, on basic consumption categories like housing, food, transportation, clothing, healthcare, childcare? Do you guys have any good numbers on these things, particularly at the low end of the spectrum? Because she's interested in poverty, so she's not interested in what people spend at the high end of the spectrum, but in the lower percentiles. And it turns out that some of these departments that you might expect to have good numbers on what people spend, transportation, Department of Labor, HUD, you would think HUD would have some good numbers on what people tend to spend on housing, utilities maybe. Health and Human Services, which administers a lot of medical programs like Medicaid and a lot of other welfare programs, child care programs, Head Start, you'd think they might have some good numbers on what people spend on basic necessities, but they did not. Energy did not. Education, Commerce did not. It turned out that the only government department that had really good numbers on what people spend on things was the Department of Agriculture. And it turns out that the Department of Agriculture had for many years been issuing 3 food plans every month: the liberal plan, the moderate cost plan, and the low cost plan. And Molly had worked over there, so she knew. And turns out that a few years before she got started on her research project, the USDA had added a 4th plan to its food plans. And this was called the Economy Plan when Molly was working on her research project. It's now called the Thrifty Plan. And the reason they added the Thrifty Plan was because they found out that even families who were following its low-cost plan, families with fairly low incomes, could and would occasionally lower their food consumption in emergency or temporary situations if they had run out of money, and they could still meet their recommended nutritional guidelines, these guidelines also being issued by the USDA. So they created this 4th plan, the Thrifty Food Plan. And it was meant to be a guideline for a diet that would meet nutritional guidelines just barely at the lowest possible cost. The Thrifty Food Plan also assumes that all food is consumed at home. It doesn't make any allowance for eating out, which the liberal and moderate cost plans do. So Molly looked at these plans and she said, well, let's just throw out the moderate cost plan. Let's throw out the liberal plan because we're talking about poverty here. and she decided to look at the Thrifty plan. A fun fact is that the USDA's Thrifty Food Plan is still the basis for the calculation of SNAP allotments, or food stamps. The USDA issues the estimated costs of its 4 food plans every month. They're easy to find out. As you see, food tends to cost more in Alaska and Hawaii, so they have their own chart. But the food plans themselves are updated every month. So this is the most recent numbers, August of 2016, and a hypothetical household with a 28-year-old single mother and a 3-year-old little girl and a 13-year-old boy. It's very simple. You just add all this together, and they would receive $432.50 in SNAP dollars per month. So, but back to Molly. Molly says, okay, how do I set a poverty threshold just based on food when people need more stuff than just food? They need other things as well, housing and so on. Then she remembered. She said, you know, when I was at the USDA in 1955, we did this household food consumption survey. And it was a pretty good survey. It had a lot of statistically reliable data, had a lot of internal validity. And the basic finding of that survey was that households were spending about a third of their after-tax incomes on food. And that ratio, a third of income on food, held pretty much across the income spectrum. Now, this was, after all, 1955. But that was the finding of the survey. So that's where our curious multiplier times 3 comes in. Molly said, well, if families are spending a third of their incomes on food, if I just multiply the Thrifty Food Plan amounts for different household types by 3, then that would be a decent poverty threshold. So here's our formula again, with all the adjustments. And again, we're taking the amount, 1962, 1963, she worked on this project over the span of a couple of years. We take that amount and we adjust it for inflation every year, and that's where our 48-cell matrix comes from. Now, let's just take stock. Here is a little map of possibilities for how we could measure poverty. We could measure poverty in a subjective way, which would be to ask people, do you feel poor? Or how poor do you feel? Maybe you would answer that question in different ways on different days. Subjective approaches care how human beings feel about their own poverty or non-poverty status. Most of the poverty measurements that we're going to learn about in this class are objective and not subjective, although some have proposed a subjective measure. If you're going to take an objective approach, you can either look at a single dimension or multiple dimensions. And in the United States, we look at a single dimension. And for each of those dimensions, the dimension can be absolute or relative. And in the United States, we look at an objective single dimension, which is absolute. Which dimension is it that we choose to focus on? It's not a household's standard of living. It's not even a household's wealth. Wealth is far more than just income. It's also not a consumption measure, although we will look at an alternative measure which does take consumption into account, that is, what people actually spend on day-to-day necessities. It doesn't take into account a household's capabilities. Its only dimension is income. And we're going to come back to this map a few times throughout this first unit in the class and see how this measure compares to other measures.